Heavenly Father, I'm so grateful that we get together to discuss your creation, Lord, and we're grateful for the creation that you've given us. And we just ask that you bless this class and bless the learning and the teaching. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. Okay. So you made it to week 4, at least 18 of you did. Uh-oh. Felt like Monday today.
Yes.
See, some of us worked yesterday. Okay, so today we're going to talk about geologic evidence. I don't even know if geologic is a word, but it is in the engineering vernacular. So we're going to talk about geologic evidence that really supports a lot of the biblical account, and particularly Noah's flood. But before we go into the flood, I wanted to just do a recap. So I'll give you a break today. I won't ask questions. So in week 1, we talked about various Earth and universe origin theories and got right to the very popular carbon-14 dating. So when someone says that something is carbon dated to be very old, I think you need to remember that it's basically saying that it's got a low proportion of carbon-14. So that's kind of the translation to the real fact. And that basically if you had no carbon-14 when the Earth was first created, it would date very old, regardless of when the Earth was created. So that could be a very deceiving thing based on your base assumption. So if you assume the carbon-14 has been the same forever, you'll get old carbon-14 dates. So week 2, we talked about a different dating method that dates billions of years, millions and billions of years, and that's uranium, potassium, strontium. We didn't actually get into some of those others, but uranium, everybody, if you remember the blue and yellow jelly beans, yellow was uranium, the blue was lead. And so one of the big problems with uranium dating was polonium halos. And what those demonstrate was that at some point in time, those polonium halos got trapped in granite, which kind of demonstrated that there were rapid decay rates of uranium once upon a time that just got sealed in place. So if you pick up a rock today and it dates pretty old, especially on uranium dating, a lot of those had accelerated decay rates. And also remember the poor dating on the recent lava flows. And just incidentally, secular scientists claim that the errant dates on the lava flows were due to high concentrations of potassium in the lava flow, that's true. But then how do you know that you're picking up a rock from billions of years old that didn't also have a high potassium concentration? And then week 3, which was just last week, we studied dinosaur remains and fossils that really could not always necessarily be evidence of prehistoric animals, but of actually animals that lived relatively recently, because fossilization of bones can happen relatively rapidly. It doesn't take millions of years. And a lot of soft tissue's been found of T-Rex bones not too long ago. And incidentally, I talked about Mary Schweitzer, who found the bone. She's actually not a young Earth creationist. Her statement to the press was basically, look how long blood cells can last. They can last millions of years. So instead of saying it's a recent bone, blood cells just last a lot longer than we originally thought. So it just depends on your perspective. Okay, so today we're going to talk about geology. Now, geology is probably, of all of the sciences that we're going to talk about, is the most speculative. Now, this just isn't among young Earth, old Earth, creationists, evolutionists. This is among traditional scientists. So it's very difficult to know exactly how the rock formations that we've gotten have gotten there. There are a lot of theories. and there are competing theories from all angles. So when I talk about a secular theory, I'm really kind of talking about the dominant traditional theory or older Earth theory. And when I talk about the biblical theory, I'm typically going to be talking about the flood, and I'll kind of talk about, I'll define both theories so you kind of get a sense of what's what. And these definitions are just, it's the most common themes between the two. So secular geology, and this is just, you know, if I were to go to middle school and pick up a book, this is what they would teach you. So the Earth was molten. The crust cooled about 4 billion years ago. So traditional scientists hold that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old because they've picked up rocks, and those are the oldest dates that they've gotten from the rocks based on potassium argon dates and uranium lead dates. So it wasn't, even though it was formed 4.5 billion years ago, it was a bunch of lava, hot lava, and you couldn't really stand on it if there were people there, which there weren't. But it was basically hot molten, cooled 4 billion years ago. After that, sediment, well, let's first of all kind of talk about where the water came from, because in a molten planet, you can kind of imagine that water can't really stay on the lava. If you've ever tried to do this, and as a kid, I used to do this all the time, pour like water into campfires and different things. It evaporates because the lava is so hot. So you can't really keep water on the ground. And so that lava actually just makes any water evaporate. So the theory is that the water was brought to Earth by meteorites or comets that had full of water. They bombarded the Earth, and that water became oceans. Now these oceans, over millions and millions of years, actually billions of years, created sedimentary layers. So I'm not going to talk about evolution today. I'm just kind of talking about the geology. And you can just kind of imagine that the language is that oceans retreated and well, they came in, they went out, and during all these different times, they left big, thick sedimentary layers. And those are the layers that if you go into the mountains and you see layers, traditional geologists believe that that's where those layers really came from. In addition to just sand dunes and that kind of thing as well. So the continents used to be one continent and have separated through plate tectonic movements. A lot of people have heard of continental drift and maybe the single continent theory, the single landmass theory. It was actually started almost, the exact same year that Darwin published Origin of Species, 1859, by a Christian young Earth creationist. Then since then, got reintroduced in 1920 and was really laughed at for a long time until about the 60s. A lot of scientists adopted it or started to adopt it. It's very similar to the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory was really laughed at by traditional sciences, and today it's kind of accepted as the theory. But this was not always part of the traditional geologic theory. The tradition used to be that the continents have always been where they've been, and there's just no way that they could really move. So through a lot of these plate tectonics, continental drift explains how mountains are created. So the plates collide, or they shear against each other, or they separate. All of these things create some pretty substantial formations in the Earth. So if you look in the oceans, and really, continental drift theory was not endorsed until they had maps of the ocean floor. So when they mapped the ocean floor, they saw these mountain ranges, and they saw these canyons. And if you look at it, it looks like, somebody took the Earth and just pulled it apart at the Atlantic Ocean and pushed it together at the Pacific Ocean. Some other things that are kind of evidence of this is if you look at what's called the Ring of Fire, and that's actually in the Pacific Ocean, and it's a bunch of volcanic activity that really surrounds the entire Pacific Ocean. So if you go through Alaska, down through Seattle, and if anybody's been in the state of Washington, you can see some amazing volcano mountains. Mount Rainier, Mount St. Helens, Mount Hood. So some really neat stuff. So, but anyway, the theories are that these plates crashed together. Some of them sublimated, which means that they went under the other plates and actually pushed up mountains. And if you look at the Earth, you can see mountain ranges right along the coasts of a lot of the continents. So it really does seem like that's how they've been created. After a lot of the mountain creation, and actually part of the mountain creation, there's an ice age. Now, secular geology says that this ice age occurred roughly 18,000 years ago, and that it melted about 10,000 years ago. And it's really, I think I talked about this a little bit last time, to have an ice age is very, very hard to do because you have to have moisture in the air and you have to have freezing conditions that last throughout a summer. So the ice in the North America, they've seen evidence of ice all the way down to Missouri. So how thick the sheet of ice was, it's really hard to tell, but the theories are that even in Minnesota, the Great Lakes were formed by glaciers, and they believe that it was about a mile thick. So that's pretty thick ice. And so, again, not saying that this isn't a biblical belief as well, but it's really not mentioned in the Bible. So the key to secular geology is it's also called uniformitarianism or uniformitarian geology. So the theory is that things happen gradually. Things that we see today are acting just as they have for millions of years, and that's what's created what we see today. So gradual erosion by either wind or water, and very gradual sedimentation. So that's the key to, and if you, like I said, you pick up any middle school or high school textbook, that's what you'll hear. Now, the biblical geology, it's a little bit different, but not much actually. There's just two big events that are quite a bit different. So the first is the creation week, or the creation event. And that's when everything was created. So in the Bible, it reads that things were created pretty much at one time. And then in Noah's day, there was a worldwide flood. And the literal, or at least my read, I should say, of the Bible is that happened pretty suddenly, and it happened not that long ago, at least in relative terms, or at least in billions of years type timescales. And then the post-flood events that biblical creationists believe, which are not specifically talked about in the Bible, but they're kind of alluded to or implied, is tectonic movement. So in the Bible, in Genesis, it basically talks about, first of all, that the water was over the tops of the mountains. And if you kind of think about the physics of the whole thing, you've got a lot of weight pushing down on the land. Things are going to move. And so a lot of this created a lot of tectonic movement. And some creationists believe that the tectonic movement split apart Pangaea, which was a single continent, during the flood. And it actually created such a rapid movement of these continents that it actually pushed them to where they are today. They stopped moving. So again, a catastrophic event. Some creationists believe that the tectonic movement of the continents happened after the flood. And the reason that some think that it happened after the flood is because of the migrations of animals. So how did animals get from the Ark to Australia, or from the Ark to North America? There are land bridges that even secular geologists, or not geologists, but anthropologists imagine today. But that's a big question: is how did all the people get to the different continents after Noah's flood? Creationists do believe in ice age. I mean, I think the evidence is very plain. There are scars in the rocks. In fact, we have a few glaciers still left in Colorado, very small now, If anybody's been to St. Mary's Glacier and seen some of those, they're pretty neat. And they leave marks. They leave scars on the rock. So when basically geologists started studying North America, they didn't see the ice. It's not like they came and the ice was there. They saw evidence of these scratches along the bottoms, along all of these valleys. And they see what glaciers do today and said, okay, this is probably the result of a glacier. And the other thing that creationists believe in is post-flood dam breaches. In other words, if you had this worldwide flood, and now all of a sudden you have these tectonic movements, you have mountain creation, you have things moving up and down, you're going to trap a large amount of water. And maybe that water forms glaciers because it freezes later in the seasons or in the seasons of the Earth, or maybe that flood water just gets trapped there as a liquid until it can breach. And then there's dam breaches. And then, obviously creationists also believe in basic erosion. So you can see, eroded events that are happening that were not catastrophic, that are gradual erosion events that the uniformitarianist geologists also believe. So let's look at the facts. So really, the two views are not that far apart, but there's clearly two major differences. It's how long it took and what actually caused it. Was it catastrophic or was it uniformitary or uniform? Not uniformitary. So the facts are this, is that we've got a foundational rock. It's a granite rock. It's a metamorphic type rock. It's igneous. And they call it the crystalline basement. And so you look around the Earth, you see this rock. Now, in some places, you can see the rock exposed. In fact, in Colorado, there are some mountains or just big exposed chunks of granite that you can see. They're just sticking out in the open. And that's because either the sediment has eroded off of it or it's been pushed up through sedimentary layers, and there's evidence of that. And again, this isn't really a debate between secular or biblical geologists. That's pretty much a fact. So there's also these other rock layers that are over this basement, and they're sedimentary, they're layered, and they're comprised typically of clay, sand, sandstone, lava that's actually from volcanoes that have exploded or erupted after the sediment has been laid. And there's also ash. And so when a volcano is erupted, there's evidence of ash layers. And so those are the different layers that are actually on top of the crystalline basement. And then there's marine fossils, and they're found all over the place. So top of Mount Everest, I've never been there. But if you were to go there, geologists claim that there are fossils there. And I've always wondered, do they just say that, or do they actually know that? And it's stated with such a matter of fact that I guess that they do know it, because it just seems to me it'd be a very harsh place to go digging for rocks. But marine fossils are found all over the place. And so they're finding clams all over the place. They're finding seashells, fish fossils on mountaintops. So, and again, this is not something that's debated. This is pretty much, it's a known thing. So a lot of the layers are consistent from continent to continent. In fact, this is another thing that kind of supports this idea of Pangea. So if you can imagine taking a layered cake and cutting it down and then shifting it, and you see both layers on both sides, you think, okay, well, the sediments at one time must have been the same. It looks like you just took the continents and kind of broke them apart. So again, these are not really debated. These are just facts. Now let's talk about the interpretation of a fact. So the Grand Canyon. I'm going to just kind of talk about the secular viewpoint, or the old Earth view of how the canyon was formed. So there's this idea that there was an ancient mountain range from Idaho to Arizona, and it was a very tall mountain range. In fact, they had a special on this just very recently on Discovery Channel, and the geologist was kind of talking about how he knew it was a tall mountain range was because the pressure that he found certain calciums in that bottom rock had to have been under high pressure. So that meant the mountains must have been very tall, pressing down pretty severely on this bottom layer where he was getting the rock. And then somehow that mountain range eroded off over millions and millions of years ago. And then the sedimentation started forming on top of it. So the oceans move back and forth to deposit a lot of the sediment. In other words, if you look at, so why are there marine fossils? Well, because a secular geologist would say that that's because it was ocean. At one time, that was all ocean, and these oceans would recede and go back and forth. So they would just leave these sand deposits. And because there's about 18 major layers, that would have had to happen about 18 times. So there's 18 layers, and if you can kind of look at that picture that we just looked at, you can see that the canyon looks very layered. You can see, and each one of these layers, from an evolutionary perspective, contains different fossils, and evolutionists believe that that's how, so the higher up in the layer, the more evolved that thing is. So again, several million years passed down between the oceans. In instances, entire sedimentary rocks were eroded away completely. And why do they know this? So they're gone. They're actually physically not there. But because of the geographic column, or the geologic column, I should say, not geographic, they expect a layer there, and the layer's gone. So it must have eroded away. And that's called what's called an unconformity. It doesn't conform to their belief of how long it took to build all of those layers. And so their belief is that if they find a certain fossil in a certain layer, these were long periods of time, so that layer can't just not exist, because they believe this geologic column is all over the world. Okay, so then how did the canyon actually form? Well, then about 40 million years ago, the Colorado River was formed, and it actually, they believe that it exited originally through Texas to the Gulf of Mexico, but then somehow actually started cutting into where the Grand Canyon is now. And while the canyon was being uplifted, and I'll show you a picture that the elevation of the canyon is actually higher than the surrounding areas, the Colorado River continued to cut the canyon as almost at the exact same rate that the tectonic uplift occurred. And then the river eventually carved through all of the sedimentary layers and then started working on the crystalline basement. And that's where it is. So if you look at the canyon today, you see where the river is. If you kind of look at the rocks, those bottom rocks are actually metamorphic and igneous rocks, which are kind of that's where they consider the bottom rock of the earth. And it's really, the Grand Canyon has been a big research project for both secular and biblical geologists, because it really just exposes all of the layers that they both kind of imagined would be there. So let's talk about a creationist or a flood, a worldwide flood view. So the flood view is that the flood actually created a lot of the layers. Now, we kind of think of as a flood, and you kind of think about this as just a flood of water kind of submerging all of the land. And there's evidence that whatever was covering the land of the Grand Canyon was flowing. In other words, this water was flowing either on or off the land and in different directions. So it was kind of going back and forth. And why do they know this, or why do they believe this? Is because the ripple patterns and some of the sedimentary layers seem to indicate that it was flowing. The other thing is that the particles of the sediment, so you see those different colors, you see the red, the white, brown, those actually came from different places. And they think they know where they came from. Now, it's kind of hard. I mean, if you can imagine even a creationist view of a worldwide flood, there's just stuff going everywhere. And so it's really kind of hard to figure out what's coming from where and exactly where it's going. But these are kind of the things that they've seen. So that, again, the creationist view is that there were receding sheets of water that eroded surface layers near the canyon. So if you look at the canyon, you can see it. You can see the rim of the canyon. That's not the top layer. And I'll kind of show you what that looks like. The top layer is actually close to Bryce Canyon, if anybody's ever been there. And it's actually way up in Utah. And it's interesting how the layers have been formed. And then the floodwaters were receding and tectonic uplift was occurring. So that meant that if you can imagine taking a plate of water and then lifting it and then that water just rushing off in a plate way. So what happens when water is spread apart is the velocity isn't as fast. So when it's narrowed down, the velocity comes much greater and there's more erosion. So the sheet flow would not have been that erosive, and it wouldn't have created canyons, but it would have taken a lot of dirt with it. And so that's the theory is that during the Great Flood, when the Rocky Mountain or the Colorado Plateau was lifting up, it was just water was sweeping off toward what today is the Pacific Ocean. And the flood water was basically trapped in a lake east of the Grand Canyon. So actually, and I'll talk about this, some secular geologists are actually thinking the same thing now. And I don't know if it was because they were influenced at all, but there is some evidence that really just seems very compelling. But that the water was actually trapped. In other words, this uplift where the Grand Canyon is created a dam. And then once that dam was made of soft sediment. So if you can imagine all the soft sediment being pushed up, and then a tunnel or something coming under that sediment, creating kind of a path for the river, and then just a catastrophic sloughing off of that soft sediment and creating what we see today as the canyon. So if you look at the canyon, and we'll look at the top of it, it really almost looks like it would be difficult for the river to create it as it is today. So that's the theory is that it was a dam breach, and that dam breach pulled a lot of dirt with it, and that's what we see, today. And so they also believe, though, just like secular geologists, that the Colorado River continues to erode this crystalline base. No different, in fact. See, they're consistent there. So this is what the canyon looks like. And I didn't really know this until I started looking into this a while ago, but it's a mountain. It kind of looks like a hill on that picture, but it's about 5,000 feet higher in the middle of the canyon than it is so where the Colorado River enters, it can't flow uphill. So that's why even secular geologists know that the river couldn't have just wore down and cut through to make the canyon. It had to have made it at the same time that land was actually being pushed up by some of these forces. So it's 5,000 feet higher, and let's kind of look at that from the top. So you can kind of see that green. This is a Google Earth map. You can do this yourself. But that green is actually, and it's in Google Earth's terrain view, and it's actually showing, that green is showing a very high altitude. And you can kind of see if you were to follow this all the way back, that's a big, it's not even a hill. It's 5,000 feet is a huge vertical. Creationists do believe that there was a dam, that there was a lake back there. So, and this is what the lake would have looked like. So if you kind of go back, and you just look at what would have filled in. So whenever they make reservoirs in Colorado, they look at where they'd put a dam, and then they look at what would all be flooded. And you can do that. You just look at elevation views or elevation contours of the area. And this is what the two lakes, actually, and they're called the Grand Lake and Hoppy Lake, would have looked like before they breached a dam. So I guess the question is, does the Grand Canyon look like, what you'd expect with a dam breach, or does it look like what you would expect with gradual erosion? And again, these are theories. There's nothing, but I think they're pretty good theories. I mean, it does look like a dam breach. Now the question is, where did it come from? And if you look at Colorado, if you drive down the I-70 corridor, you'll actually notice this interesting pattern where it kind of expands, and then it necks down into a canyon. If you've gone into Glenwood Canyon, just before that is the Eagle River and Colorado River Valley, actually Eagle River Valley mostly, and it's pretty wide, and then all of a sudden it necks down into the Glenwood Springs Canyon. And there's actually 3 formations in Colorado going west that look that way. And it's really not just a Grand Canyon theory, it's probably most of the canyon theory. So here's the canyon. This is in Georgia. It's called Providence Canyon. Does anybody have any idea how it was made? A river flowing through it over millions and millions of years. No, actually. So in the 1800s, not very long ago, so you can kind of see there's still growth there and everything else. There is runoff from poor irrigation. And actually, if you look at a lot of our water conservation, contour farming and different things that we do today, this was actually one of the things, one of the proofs that farmers use to try to keep water in one place without eroding the soil. So this is basically a farmer who was irrigating, and then there was a lot of rain runoff, and then the soil just gave way. So it gave way, it collapsed, and this is what they had. And so this was a canyon that was formed literally within weeks, just because of the erosion that happened. It was not a gradual process. And so things like this really kind of make you look at the Grand Canyon a little bit differently. Now, the question is, are there any others? So, any ideas how this formed? So this is actually a canyon. It's got sedimentary layers. It's found near Walla Walla, Washington. So it's doggone farmers again. So what happened was they basically had a small irrigation ditch, and it was diverted into a small gully. They were trying to clear the ditch. They had a bunch of weeds in it. And basically, there was 80 cubic feet a second of water that created this gully in Washington. And again, within a very short period of time. It was basically 6 days, and it carried away 15 million cubic feet of soil. So, and it's about 120 feet deep, just to kind of get a perspective of how deep that actually is. And you can see what's interesting here is that you see those layers. And a lot of farmers there would tell you that those layers, obviously, they probably put some of those layers there, just, going back and forth over the soil, but those are very fine layers, obviously different than the Grand Canyon layers. But again, it kind of proves that the canyons can be formed in a really short period of time. But we're talking on the Grand Canyon about a dam breach. And here's some canyons that are in eastern Washington called the Scablands. And I don't know if anybody's been there. I have not. So, but most uniformitarian geologists were pretty much convinced that these Scablands were formed, again, gradual erosion over millions of years. And then a real crazy guy named Harlan Bretz was brave enough to tout this dam breach idea. Now, he was not a young Earth creationist. He was just a geologist that said, look, I don't think this was caused by gradual erosion. In fact, his theory was, and this was in 1920, that a large lake was formed with a glacier, and it was called Lake Missoula, and that it had breached, and it actually created the Scablands in a matter of days. And so he was laughed at. And again, he wasn't necessarily a young Earth geologist. He was just saying, hey, look, this is what created this. But again, a lot of the secular geologists at the time, just like not wanting to believe Pangea, Big Bang, or some other things, they kind of get set in their ways just like anybody. And I think that it was difficult for them to believe that had actually happened. Well, as we got satellite images of that area, it then became obvious. So Google, we get a lot of satellite images. You can get them on your computer all the time. But in 1920, they didn't know what a satellite was. So, so basically in 1979, Bretz was actually given an award. And a lot of the old Earth geologists pretty much admit that, okay, there is catastrophic events. It's just Noah's flood wasn't one of them. And so because it was a glacier, ice age, all right, we'll give you that one. And so it is believed now that the Scablands was actually formed from a catastrophic dam breach of the glacier that actually had created Lake Missoula. And so here's kind of a picture of where the lake would have been. So I showed kind of a picture of one of the canyons. If you blow up and if you look at kind of a, because you can look at it on Google now too, and it's pretty. So once it made its initial erosion effort, then it kind of went downstream and it actually kind of branched out a little bit more. So is there any other evidence of something